April 7, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The Japanese command still asserted with conviction no American fighter could reach the imperial capital from the Pacific. This guarantee, repeated by generals and passed from base to base, sustained the last illusion of the empire's invulnerability, a conviction built not on data, but on faith and misinformation. That conviction was about to evaporate before a simple metallic silhouette in the sky. That morning, dozens of silver dots crossed the coast of Honshu. They were not B-29 bombers, already expected. They were single-engine fighters. They were Mustangs. Their presence over Tokyo not only violated Japanese airspace, it demolished the last technical certainty of the military leadership. That distance still protected them. This documentary will reveal how the P-51D Mustang, underpinned by U.S. industrial mathematics, achieved what once seemed like fiction, escorting bombers on a 1,500-mile round-trip mission, taking on the best of Japan's arsenal, and winning before it even fired. What for the Japanese was impossible began to fly. But before we dive into the technicalities, there's one statistic that defines everything that happened that day. 103 B-29 bombers were approaching Tokyo, and along with them, more than 90 P-51Ds surfaced from 750 miles away, flying in perfect formation with enough fuel to escort, fight, and return. In the interception, more than 100 Japanese planes were hastily launched, but they faced something that their manuals said was impossible. The result? A kill ratio of 13-1, and that was just the beginning. The numbers that support this story reveal an invisible chasm between what Japan believed to be invulnerable and what America had already routinely turned into. If you value the story told accurately, based on facts and engineering, consider leaving your support with a like and subscribing. This allows us to continue showing that, behind each statistic, there is a turning point that changed the world. For much of the war, the Japanese High Command held to an almost religious tactical certainty. The skies of the home islands were the last safe hold. The physical distance between the archipelago and the American bases was treated as a natural barrier. According to his generals, there was no way for single-engine fighters to escort bombers so far. This belief, based on maps, outdated calculations, and doctrinal pride, was repeated so often that it became dogma. The result was the creation of a strategic blind zone, a breach built by one's own conviction of invulnerability. While Japanese strategists bet on geography, American engineers bet on physics. Imperial doctrine was still shaped by the spirit of the samurai: courage, sacrifice, honor, elements that, while noble, do not guarantee air superiority. The American war machine, on the other hand, worked under a different logic. If something seemed impossible, it was just a matter of scale, repetition, and adaptation. Thus, in 1945, the distance between Iwo Jima and Tokyo ceased to be an obstacle and became just another logistical factor to be solved. The U.S. Air Force did not win by boldness. He won by insistence. For each problem, an assembly line; for each obstacle, an engineering spreadsheet. Japan, for its part, still relied on breaches of expectation, mysticism, and desperate maneuvers. It was a model of warfare stuck in the previous century, facing a nation that had turned production into a precision science. The Japanese belief that the sea was an impenetrable barrier to single-engine fighters was not only inaccurate, it was dangerously anachronistic. The P-51D Mustang had already demonstrated in the skies of Europe that its range could cross countries. What has changed in the Pacific is the extreme application of this concept, flying more than 750 miles just to reach the target, facing resistance, consuming fuel, and still returning home. This was considered unthinkable by doctrines based on close-quarters combat, where bravery was measured in minutes of confrontation, not hours of flight. And yet, by early 1945, American engineers had already developed disposable fuel tanks, optimized navigation systems, and intensive training to train pilots capable of crossing oceans alone. Japan's strategy for defending the territory ignored that the U.S. Air Force had become a global entity, capable of operating in multiple theaters, coordinated by data, supplied by factories that produced 24 hours a day. A simple comparison reveals the abyss. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced more than 300,000 aircraft. Japan in the same period produced just over 70,000, and with increasingly decreasing quality. In 1944 alone, American industry manufactured more planes than Japan in the entire war. If this statistic surprises you, write in the comments "logistics wins." This type of number, ignored by Japanese doctrine, was what really defined the outcome in the Pacific. While Japanese radars detected bomber formations coming from the south, the idea that fighter jets could keep up with them seemed so far-fetched that some officials even ignored the reports. The airspace over Tokyo was seen as an unreachable shrine, protected by myth, distance, and self-deception. This assumption not only weakened defensive readiness, it eroded anticipation. When the first Mustangs appeared, there was hesitation, doubt, disbelief. Air defense units were unprepared to fight enemy fighters so well-armed, fast, and coordinated, and the most devastating, coming from where it was not expected. The surprise was not only military, it was moral. To see American fighter jets flying over the heart of the empire, flying low over stations, factories, and airfields, was not only a defeat, it was a public demoralization. The myth of invulnerability had been shattered with a metallic sound coming from the west, and the question that remained in the air, echoing between the hangars and bunkers, was simple and paralyzing. How did they get here? The answer, as we will see below, lies in the cold and merciless numbers of an industry that worked like clockwork. Because, contrary to what many believed, the P-51D Mustang did not win by surprise. He won by repetition. And in the next chapter, we will see how this machine was designed to fly not only against the enemy, but against the very idea of limit. The North American P-51 Mustang wasn't born as an American icon, it was born as a British commission. In 1940, the United Kingdom was looking for an emergency fighter to defend its skies in the face of the German threat. North American aviation, until then, a company with little experience in high-performance fighters, promised something that no one else offered: a new project delivered in record time. In just 117 days, the first prototype was flying. It was a fast plane, well-armed, but limited by its Allison engine, which suffered above 15,000 feet. What the British engineers did next changed history. They installed the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The marriage of American aerodynamics and British propulsion produced an anomaly, a single-engine fighter capable of flying so far and so high that it changed the entire logic of air warfare. The D model, the most emblematic version, incorporated all the improvements harvested on the European battlefield. Its Packard Vecina 1657 engine, a licensed version of the Merlin 66 manufactured in Detroit, generated 1,520 horsepower in emergency, with a two-stage supercharger system that maintained power even above 30,000 feet. But it wasn't just strength, it was efficiency. The laminar wing developed by Edgar Schmood reduced drag by up to 35% compared to conventional profiles. This meant that with 110-gallon drop tanks, the P-51D could fly 2,000 miles, consume less fuel, and maintain cruising speed for hours. For the first time, American aviation was able to project air power with full escort. Heavy bombers, once decimated en routes over Germany, were now escorted to Berlin and back. The Mustang didn't just attack, it stayed. In the Pacific, this capability has been taken to the extreme. From Iwo Jima to Tokyo, round trip, with combat time, in a single-engine aircraft. This was more than innovation. It was a direct answer to the question that haunted commanders: how to protect the bomber when the range exceeds the logic of the escort. The answer came in the form of an agile, low-maintenance machine, with standardized parts and a cockpit designed for rider comfort and efficiency. Uncluttered panels, 360-degree visibility with bubble canopy, adjustable controls, and brutally effective weaponry. 6 Browning 50 M2 machine guns with up to 1,880 rounds in total, each one firing 800 rounds per minute. With this, the Mustang could launch 80 projectiles per second, incendiary, armor-piercing, capable of tearing through fuselages and igniting engines with surgical precision. But what impressed was not only the performance, it was the scale. North America's factories in Inglewood and Dallas produced Mustangs as if they were cars, one every hour. The D model alone, exceeded 8,000 units manufactured. For comparison, this was more than Japan could produce of any fighter in the final 2 years of the war, adding up all the variants. American industrial supremacy materialized in the air, not in slogans, but in aluminum, octane, and speed. While Japan still used inferior fuel and wood for camouflage, Mustangs appeared in pairs in close formation with multi-channel VHF radio and flight plans built on maps updated by photographic reconnaissance and advanced meteorology. It was war elevated to the level of science. A North American engineer described the P-51 as a high-precision calculation disguised as a fighter, and that's exactly what he was, a solved equation. His enemies, on the other hand, were still drawing hypotheses on paper. In the skies of Europe, he had shattered the myth of the Luftwaffe. In the Pacific, it was about to demolish Japan's last psychological wall, the idea that national airspace was sacred. But what was left for the Japanese when they realized that these fighters not only flew to Tokyo, but returned with fuel to spare? The response was not only strategic, it was moral. And the first to feel this was not a general, but a young Japanese driver when he saw for the first time the curved silhouette of a Mustang crossing the sky over Mount Fuji. The impact of this meeting would be just the beginning of a chain of revelations. Because on the next mission, the Mustang wouldn't come alone. He would bring with him the ruthless arithmetic of a war decided by spreadsheets, not promises. On April 7, 1945, before sunrise, 108 P-51D Mustang fighters took off from Iwo Jima, heading north, accompanying 103 B-29 bombers. It was an unprecedented mission, to cross more than 750 miles of open ocean in a single engine with no escape route, no alternative airfield, no margin for failure. Each pilot carried with him only a compass, a stopwatch, rigorous navigation instructions by dead reckoning, and complete confidence in American accuracy. It was a leap in the dark, sustained by mathematics. For 3 hours, they flew over a sea without reference, where any breakdown meant death by drowning or exposure. The psychological weight of this flight was no less than the physical one. The Packard Merlin engine was running at full effort, consuming fuel from disposable tanks, with the pilot adjusting mixture, intake pressure, and rotation manually, according to the cruise regime stipulated by flight intelligence. Each drop of fuel was calculated to the millimeter. The external tanks would only be dropped at the exact point, 40 miles before the Japanese coast. It was the moment when the Mustangs would cease to be invisible scouts and take on their true mission, to clear the sky before the bombers arrived. Meanwhile, across the sea, Japan slept in its doctrinal confidence. The Air Defense Command still bet that no mission departing from Iwo Jima could include an effective escort. His calculations were based on old assumptions, ignoring recent advances in aerodynamics, fuel efficiency, and American navigational accuracy. It was a fatal misperception, built on years of internal propaganda, technical underestimation, and strategic isolation. The journey to Tokyo wasn't just geographical, it was historic. For the first time, an escort fighter would cross the entire Western Pacific Theater, connecting Detroit's industrial engineering to the airspace of Mount Fuji. The route passed through areas of maritime turbulence, unstable weather formations, and invisible threats. And yet, the Mustangs arrived in formation with enough fuel to fight, escort, and return. It was the materialization of the improbable, and more, it was the normalization of the improbable. Long-distance, single-engine flight over the open sea, without the support of ships or airfields, was considered suicide by most European scholars and by all Japanese. But for the pilots of the 15th Fighter Group, it was Tuesday. The April 7th mission was symbolic, not only for its route but for its accuracy. The fighters reached the point of separation in just the right time, adjusted altitudes, positioned themselves ahead of the bomber squadrons, and scanned the sky with tactical discipline. Within minutes, they intercepted Japanese formations that were taking off in panic, disorganized, and, in many cases, with serious mechanical problems. The impact of the Mustang's arrival was immediate and devastating. The accounts of the Japanese pilots reveal a mixture of surprise, incredulity, and impotence. There was no expectation of engaging American fighters in that airspace. Previous orders did not even contemplate this scenario. The reaction was late, fragmented, and the results speak for themselves. 21 Japanese planes shot down in combat, plus 5 destroyed on the ground. 1 Mustang lost to anti-aircraft fire, another shot down by fighter, 3 returning damaged. The cost was minimal, the presence maximum. But perhaps the most shocking aspect wasn't the combat performance, but the way these fighters arrived, fought, and disappeared, as if they were projections of a force that Japan simply couldn't catch up with. It was on this flight that Mount Fuji lost its natural barrier symbolism. For the first time in the war, a foreign fighter passed it in a straight line, not as an exception, but as part of a schedule. The image of the Mustang flying at 20,000 feet over the Japanese sacred was more than a military scene. It was a psychological rupture, a reminder that while Japan believed in geographical boundaries, Americans believed in spreadsheets. And that's precisely why in the next chapter we'll see how the Japanese drivers reacted to the impossible with what they still had left: surprise, instinct, and shock. Because the first sight of the enemy in the sky over Tokyo was not a blast, it was silence. When the first silver dots appeared in the sky over Tokyo that April morning, few knew what they were seeing. Most radars were still being adjusted, ground communication was fragmented, and previous reports spoke only of bomber formations. But here they were, fast, low, and in close formation. They were not Zeros, they were not B-29 bombers. They were single-engine enemy fighters, dozens of them, fast, armed, silent in their approach. For many Japanese pilots on the ground, the first reaction was not combat but confusion. How was that possible? What kind of aircraft was that, and how had it crossed the Pacific? The reports collected after the war reveal a state of generalized psychological shock. A young Japanese officer, when questioned in 1946, stated, "I thought they were our planes until I realized they were strafing the base." The irony of this story is that the solution had been before Japan's eyes for months, in reconnaissance photos, in reports of previous missions, in production patterns that suggested something new. But the Doctrine ignored the signs. He preferred myth to analysis. The appearance of the Mustangs was not only unexpected, it was technically unacceptable. The Japanese spreadsheets said that a fighter with that profile could never be there. And yet, there they were, flying over the imperial capital with the tranquility of those who know the way. To many soldiers on the ground, it seemed like a divine warning. For the pilots in the hangars, it was the collapse of a logic that, until then, had sustained Japan's last strategic illusion. And while Mustangs made low passes over hangars, trains, and artillery positions, radio operators tried in vain to coordinate a response. But the answer did not come. Not out of cowardice, but out of inability. The Japanese Air Command had not prepared its pilots to face fighters in that space, and even less fighters, with such performance, range, and aggressiveness. The silence of the radios, the slowness of takeoffs, and the panic of the controllers created a scenario that no exercise had foreseen. Within minutes, the sky of the Japanese capital had changed hands. The impact was not only tactical, it was narrative. All the propaganda built around the divine wind, the kamikaze as the ultimate guardian of the sacred ground, had been pierced by a metallic sound coming from the west. The war Japan was fighting was symbolic, but the enemy flew with numbers, maps, and 100-octane gasoline. The difference wasn't just in the wings, it was in the approach. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts and observing how engineering and doctrine faced each other in mid-flight, show your support, like, and subscribe. This helps us to continue bringing stories that reveal what the manuals do not tell. Because this story is not over yet. In the next chapter, we will see how the Japanese fighters tried to react, and how the direct confrontation between the Hayate and the Mustang revealed in a few minutes the technical abyss that no pilot, no matter how brave, could bridge. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, known to the Allies as Frank, was, in theory, the best fighter ever produced by Japan. Fast, agile, and armed with two 20mm cannons and two 12.7mm machine guns, the Hayate was designed to take on American aircraft on an equal footing, and on some occasions, it came close to it. Its Nakajima Hay-45 engine, a 118-800 horsepower radial, promised performance equivalent to the Merlin of Mustangs, with a top speed of over 600 km/h and a respectable rate of climb. But like almost everything else in the Japanese war effort in 1945, the Hayate suffered from an insoluble contradiction. It was brilliant on paper and fragile in practice. Japanese industry, under constant bombardment, could not maintain a minimum quality standard. The same aircraft that, in ideal tests, could outperform Allied fighters, in real combat suffered from cylinder failures, landing gear cracks, electrical failures, and control cable problems. Many pilots took off knowing that half the squadron would not make it to combat, not because of the enemy, but because of the machine itself. In contrast, the P-51D Mustang was a product of standardization. Each piece was interchangeable. Each instrument had been tested in extreme conditions. Maintenance was simplified, access to the engine was facilitated, and instrument panels were standardized on all aircraft. This meant that any American driver could sit in any Mustang and operate with complete confidence. Japanese pilots, on the other hand, had to know individually the defects and quirks of their own aircraft, because each unit had unique flaws. The comparison between the two planes goes beyond the technical sheet. It reveals two incompatible war philosophies. The Hayate represented Japan trying to catch up with courage, improvisation, and good engineering, sabotaged by shortages. The Mustang was the expression of a country that had anticipated the problem and solved it with scale production, efficient logistics, and standardized training. When the two faced each other over Tokyo, the duel was not balanced. A Japanese pilot, a survivor of the 73rd Sentai, wrote years later, "The Hayate was like a samurai with cracked armor. The Mustang, a precision machine. We flew with soul, they with a system." And that made all the difference. Mustangs could fly higher, dive faster without losing control, and recover energy more efficiently in defensive maneuvers. Their radios allowed for real-time tactical coordination. The Hayates, even when well piloted, operated in isolation, often without any communication, and with weapons that, for lack of quality ammunition, often failed at critical moments. In theory, the Ki-84 could face the P-51. In practice, few came back to tell. And even when a Japanese pilot managed to shoot down a Mustang, the cost was always very high. Mechanics pushed to the limit, scarce fuel, counted ammunition, and the certainty that there would be no replacement for his plane. It was a war of attrition where Japan could not lose a single one, while the Americans produced 50 a day. Over the weeks following the first engagement, reports showed an unstoppable trend. For every Japanese fighter shot down, the Americans lost less than a quarter of their aircraft. And in some missions, such as the one on April 19th, the ratio was 20-1. It was the mathematical collapse of a doctrine based on courage against a strategy based on logistics. One of the most ignored statistics of the air war is also one of the most revealing. While the United States had 100 to 130 octane jet fuel, Japan operated at 87 or even less in 1945. This not only limited the performance of the engines, but also made it impossible for the Hayate to deliver its projected potential. He was fast, but with inferior fuel, he became just a pretty target. Mustangs, on the other hand, operated on refined fuel, stabilizing additives and supply lines that traveled thousands of miles on time. The final irony is brutal. Japan, a nation with a tradition of precision, was now facing an adversary that had turned production into art and supply into science. The fight between the Hayate and the Mustang wasn't just between fighter jets. It was between two worlds that no longer shared the same historical time. And this difference would be even more evident when we look at what happened behind the cockpits, the level of experience of the pilots, because no matter how good a machine was, it only flies well in the right hands. And in Japan in 1945, the pilots were no longer ready. They came in a hurry, poorly trained and condemned. The Mustang's real strength didn't just come from the engine, the blade wings, or the 650 caliber machine guns. It came from something that the enemy could not see, and therefore did not understand. It was the invisible logistics chain that began thousands of miles from combat and ended with millimeter precision on the target. The fuel that powered the P-51Ds was not just any gasoline. It was 100 to 130 octane avgas, refined in Texan factories, loaded onto coastal trains, transferred to tankers protected by anti-submarine convoys, crossing the Pacific to bases in Guam, Saipan, and finally Iwo Jima. Japan, on the other hand, had already lost its external oil sources in 1944 and operated on unstable synthetic fuel, with insufficient octane rating for the Ki-84's high-compression radial engines. Even the little remaining fuel needed to be rationed. At many Japanese bases there was only low-quality kerosene, enough for engine testing on the ground but not for actual missions. While American pilots refueled at bases with pressurized lines and specialized maintenance crews, the Japanese relied on makeshift drums, hand syringes, and silent prayers that the filters would not be clogged. And it wasn't just the fuel. Each Mustang operated with a multi-channel VHF radio, which allowed for clear communication between squadrons, mission control, and real-time tactical alerts. Japanese fighters mostly operated with analog AM radios, with limited range, constant static, and prone to complete failures. Many flew in total silence. This meant that even if they spotted the enemy first, they could not alert their comrades. A surprise attack became a repeated tragedy, and there was no way to coordinate a response. On the American side, information flowed even before takeoff. Telex weather forecasts, up-to-date photographic reconnaissance, positioning of rescue submarines along the route, real floating rescue points ready to rescue pilots shot down at sea. A Mustang that crashed in the Pacific had a 60% chance of being rescued within 24 hours. A Japanese pilot, when he was shot down, had one certainty: death. Because there was no search system, there was no warning, there was no fuel to look for anyone. The American support structure included doctors, squad psychologists, technicians specialized in hydraulics, radarists, cooks, mechanics with spare parts for any emergency. The Japanese structure, by contrast, operated with reduced crews, cannibalized parts from destroyed planes and outdated maps, some still based on pre-war surveys. The scenery in the hangars was a portrait of decay: patched tires, hydraulic systems sealed with cloth, cracked exhaust pipes, cockpits secured with wires. And even so, the pilots kept taking off. They were driven into battle more by faith than by strategy. Many had received less than 50 hours of flight time before combat. And most dramatically, much of this training was done without live ammunition. It was common to practice shooting with unloaded weapons, just listening to the sound of the click of the machine guns. The result was a pilot who, upon entering combat, faced not only the enemy, but his own inexperience, his own dilapidated plane, and the absence of any technical support. Meanwhile, the Mustang arrived in the theater of operations after hundreds of hours of flight time in simulators, training camps with real targets, doctrine based on integrated squadrons, and pilots trained to make tactical decisions together. The difference between the two sides was not only in courage, it was in the system. One was driven by planning, the other improvisation. One flew with predictability, the other with despair. War, as always, rewarded those who could sustain the error and punished those who could not repeat it. The United States could miss one mission and launch another the next day. Japan could not afford to lose a single plane because there was no substitute, there was no fuel, there was no time. And yet, Japanese doctrine insisted that the spirit surpassed the machine, that the pilot's will compensated for the inferiority of the equipment. But heaven does not respect ideology. It responds to physics, calculation, and maintenance. And in this respect, Mustangs flew with an advantage in all directions. The proof of this would come not only in the numbers, but in the testimonies of the Japanese pilots themselves. Because in the next part, we will hear how they describe the encounter with the impossible. The shock of seeing what their doctrine said was legend, become reality over their heads. Major James Tapp, commander of the 78th Fighter Squadron, flew at the head of the formation. In front of him, the sky still looked clear, but radar operators had already reported movement south of Tokyo. From the ground, columns of fine smoke rose, a harbinger of a hasty Japanese response. Mustangs flying at 25,000 feet had the defining advantage of any aerial combat: altitude, speed, and choice of moment. The V formation unfolded with timed precision. Each wing knew its position, each pilot its function. There was no room for improvisation, only execution. On the Japanese side, takeoffs were erratic. Many Hayates and Zeros climbed without mutual cover. Others could not even get off the ground due to mechanical problems. Those who climbed did so at different angles, different heights, and without communication. It was a disorganized swarm trying to react to a surgical blow. When the Mustangs dived, the Tokyo sky turned into a lethal geometry. The American doctrine of energy fighting, fighting by controlling kinetic energy, choosing when to engage and when to flee, has reached its apex. The Mustangs dived at high speed, fired in decisive seconds, and climbed back up without losing momentum. The Japanese, on the contrary, tried horizontal maneuvers, sharp turns, as if they were still in 1941, and in this tactical choice, they lost all energy. They became immobile targets. The 50 caliber Browning M2s weren't cannons, they were saws. Each Mustang carried 6 of these guns, with a combined rate of fire of 4,800 rounds per minute. The incendiary and armor-piercing shells tore through fuselages, blew up fuel tanks, destroyed wings in 2 or 3 seconds of visual contact. The Hayate, even resistant, could not survive a full frontal fire. The Zeros simply disintegrated. Many Japanese pilots did not even realize they were being attacked. The approach of the Mustangs was so fast, so precise, that the first shots came before visual identification. And because Japanese radios didn't work or didn't exist at all, the squadrons couldn't react as a unit. It was every man for himself. Some tried to climb to gain altitude, but the engines failed due to the poor mixture, poor fuel, and poor maintenance. Others dived in flight, but were overtaken and machine-gunned in a downward trajectory. The combat didn't last minutes, it lasted seconds. In a single coordinated attack, 13 Japanese aircraft were shot down. In return, only 1 Mustang was damaged, returning with sufficient fuel and pilot unharmed. The disproportion was technical, but also symbolic. Japan still trained lone heroes. The United States formed disciplined squadrons, integrated by radio, instructed in common manuals and strategies. It was war as a product, and the result was inevitable. One piece of data defines this abyss. In 1944, the United States produced 96,000 planes, Germany produced 39,000, Japan 28,000. In that year alone, American industry manufactured more aircraft than Germany and Japan combined. If this statistic surprised you, write in the comments, logistics wins. Because numbers like this don't lie, they anticipate the end. Major Tapp shot down 2 fighters that day. At the end of the mission, he returned to Iwo Jima with remaining ammunition and with the confidence that this type of operation would be routine. For the Japanese, it was the announcement of a new phase of the war, a phase in which not even the sky over the capital was safe. The Japanese command, in the face of the reports, hesitated to believe it. How single-engine fighters had crossed the sea, fought effectively, returned accurately, and done all this again days later. The doctrine had collapsed, and with it the morale of an air force that no longer even controlled its own hangars. In the next chapter, we'll unravel how this chain of collapses forced Japan to make desperate decisions, launching planes without weapons, reducing training time, and betting everything on the last currency they still had: human sacrifice. As the last Mustangs crossed the horizon again toward Iwo Jima, the Tokyo sky didn't explode in celebration or reaction. It just plunged into heavy silence. The mission had been an unqualified tactical success. 26 Japanese planes shot down, dozens of ground targets hit. Not a single B-29 bomber lost. But for the returning pilots, the feeling was more complex. 2 Mustangs did not return. One of them fell into the sea after being hit by anti-aircraft fire. The pilot was rescued by an American submarine hours later. The other was last seen fighting alone south of Yokohama. His body was never found. He had crossed 1,000 miles of ocean, fought over the enemy's capital, and disappeared. Even in victory there was mourning, but on the other side the toll was devastating. In a single morning, Japan had lost not only aircraft, but experienced pilots, entire hangars, morale, and, perhaps most painfully, the narrative. The testimonies of the few Japanese pilots who returned were almost unanimous. There was no way to win. One of them, interviewed after the war, said, "I fought with courage, but when I saw the Mustangs, I realized that courage was no longer enough." The sky, previously described as sacred in the communique of the High Command, had been violated by fast, metallic, organized planes. The impact wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The radars failed, the radios failed, the engines failed. And men, even though they were willing to die, failed because they were alone. The war that was now unfolding was not between men, it was between systems. And the Japanese, hitherto sustained by honor, improvisation, and tradition, was collapsing in the face of American precision, logistics, and repetition. The silence that hung over Tokyo after the attack was not one of destruction, but of awareness. In the barracks, in the hangars, in the houses still untouched by the bombs, a question began to repeat itself. How can we continue? The violation of airspace was not just a loss of control, it was the herald of a new era, a time when the enemy no longer needed to improvise, nor to take extreme risks. He would come, strike, and return home, safely. This was not war. It was arithmetic, and against numbers, no philosophy resists for long. If the previous battle had shown the difference between courage and organization, what followed would reveal something even more cruel, that Japan was fighting an enemy it already knew it would win. An enemy who, by the time he landed his Mustangs back on Iwo Jima, was already preparing the next mission. Because while Tokyo digested its silence, the American machine kept turning. And at the center of this gear now emerged a new factor, a group of pilots willing to cross the impossible, and not to return. At the height of its production, Japan managed to manufacture about 3,500 units of the Ki-84 Hayate fighter, a respectable number if it were a design tournament. But the war wasn't an exhibition, it was a brutal statistical sequence. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the United States produced more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, with uniform standards, interchangeable parts, and systematic quality control. At full capacity, one unit rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. While the Japanese hammered carlings with hand tools in damaged hangars, the Americans mounted fighters on production conveyors with timed logistics. The operational availability rate of these Mustangs exceeded 80%. In other words, out of every 10 planes, 8 were always ready to fly, rearm, and return to combat. In Japan, this rate was barely over 30%. Out of every 10 Hayates, only 3 took off, and they didn't always return. The reason? Lack of parts, fuel, qualified technicians, infrastructure, everything. With each mission, the Japanese Air Force became smaller, weaker, more improvised. The arithmetic left no doubt. For every Hayate shot down, there was no immediate replacement. For every Mustang lost, there were 2 on the way to replacement. While Japan folded in on itself in attempts to preserve what still worked, the United States allowed itself to dare. Long-range missions, wave attacks, tactical experiments. Because they could. Because they had somewhere to get it from. The stock was the invisible advantage. By February 1945, the U.S. Army had more planes available than all Japanese aviation combined, on land, air, and sea. It was no longer a question of bravery or expertise, but of logistics applied on a continental scale. Japan, surrounded and with its sea lanes collapsed, relied on recycled aluminum, synthetic rubber, and inexperienced pilots. And the cruelest thing, even when he managed to produce a fighter, he had no way to fuel or arm it effectively. The jail was broken. The result was a fleet of machines that did not fly. The Japanese war effort was imploding internally, not for lack of bravery, but for failing to operate at the pace that the war had assumed. Modern air warfare was no longer decided in the cockpit, it was decided in the factory, and in this arena, Japan had already lost. If this reality surprises you, comment, "Shocking data." Because it's not just about airplanes, it's about mathematics applied to the battlefield. The Mustang's mission over Tokyo was made possible not only by the aircraft itself, but because there was an entire system behind it, ready to sustain, repeat, and extend it. Japan, on the other hand, was entering a survival mode. And with the collapse of production and replacement, the empire turned to the only resource it could still manufacture in numbers: human sacrifice. But how would the world react to a generation of young people sent to die with no chance of return? The answer would come with the most dreaded sound in the Pacific, the dive of a plane that never planned to land. At the beginning of the war, Japan trained its pilots rigorously. The process was slow, selective, demanding. Only the best made it to the cockpits. But as the conflict dragged on and losses piled up, that pattern began to crumble. In 1941, a Japanese pilot could reach the front with 500 hours of flight time. By 1945, that number had plummeted to 50, in many cases 30. Flight hours that included no simulated combat, nor practice shooting with live ammunition. Fuel shortages forced instructors to save every pint. The students went up, made basic turns, and went down. They were taught more to keep the plane in the air than to fight. There was not enough ammunition even to practice ground shooting. Many pilots learned to aim only with words, listening to instructions next to unloaded guns, and when they took off for the real mission, the first time they pulled the trigger, it was to kill or be killed. On the other hand, the United States adopted an inverse doctrine: train a lot to make fewer mistakes. Each American pilot completed between 200 and 400 hours of flight time before reaching combat. Of these, dozens of hours were dedicated to live shooting, simulated dogfights, and missions with veterans. Americans also flew standardized airplanes with identical panels, common manuals, and centralized instructions. Each man knew what to expect, how to react, what to do if something went wrong. For the Japanese, war was a lottery. Many were sent to the front without ever having practiced squadron training. Others did not know how to operate radios or had not even flown at night. A Japanese Air Force report from February 1945 reveals that more than 40% of new pilots did not have complete mastery of compass navigation. It was like throwing apprentices into a storm, blindfolded. The result was cruel. The skies of the Pacific have become open tombs. Young people rushed in unprepared, facing veteran enemies, well-equipped, organized. The cockpit, which was once a symbol of honor, has become a place of sentence. Most did not return, and everyone knew it. The collapse of training wasn't just technical, it was moral. The Japanese pilots began to say goodbye before the missions, leaving letters, prayers, personal belongings, because deep down, they knew they were going to sacrifice, not to combat. Meanwhile, the Americans maintained rotation routines. Pilots rested, received psychological support, returned to combat with new aircraft, new ammunition, new squadrons. They weren't sent to die, they were sent to win. The difference was structural, but also philosophical. Japan treated its pilots as warriors of an epic finale. The United States treated them as operators of a system, and the system won. If this sounds shocking, consider the data recorded at the end of April 1945. For every American pilot shot down, the Japanese lost between 6 and 9, not because of individual inferiority, but because the machine around each one was completely different. Bravery alone was an engine without a propeller. In the end, heaven does not reward the most willing, it rewards the most prepared. And this difference would become even more cruel in the next chapter, when Japan, unable to keep fighters in flight, decides to use the last planes as live projectiles. Because when you can no longer fight, all that remains is to fall. In the sky, seeing is only half the battle. Listening and being heard defines who lives and who falls. In April 1945, as Mustangs tore through the skies over Japan with millimeter precision and coordination, Japanese fighters moved like disjointed shadows, unable to form a cohesive tactical unit. The reason was invisible, but lethal: silence. The radios installed on Japanese planes were mostly valve devices, fragile, sensitive to altitude, humidity, and vibration. Many did not function beyond certain altitudes. Others failed even before takeoff, and even those who did spoke different tongues. The lack of standardization between Air Force and Navy models made cross-communication impossible. A Navy pilot could not ask for reinforcements from an Army squadron, a ground base could not coordinate actions with naval bombers, and a squadron of Hayates could fly in total silence without knowing that another unit of Zeros had already been shot down minutes earlier. Meanwhile, the P-51D Mustang operated with multi-channel VHF radios, with fast switches, clean signal, and a range of more than 100 miles in the open sky. Pilots could communicate with B-29 bombers, with other squadrons, with mission controllers on the ground, and even with support ships. Each flight was a synchronized network, capable of reacting in seconds to any threat. The American command system worked like a glass tower. Everything was seen, everything was heard, and decisions were distributed in real time. Japan operated on stone towers. Messages took time, got lost, or didn't arrive at all. Many missions were launched with incomplete orders, misinterpreted or based on outdated information. Communication between pilots, when it occurred, was done by hand signals or assumptions. There was no way to coordinate group maneuvers, synchronized attacks, or emergency warnings. Air warfare requires eyes to see, but it requires ears to decide. And Japan was blind and deaf. During the fighting over Tokyo, numerous Japanese pilots reported not knowing they were being attacked until they saw the crossfire exploding in front of them. No alert, no escort, no command. It was like fighting blindfolded. An American report, analyzing the wreckage of a downed Japanese fighter jet, revealed that the onboard radio was turned off, taped down, and with the wires cut to save weight. Another Japanese pilot, captured after crashing on Iwo Jima, revealed that his last instruction had been to fly in the direction of engine sounds. This was the level of interception doctrine at that point in the war. While the Americans operated with doctrines based on escort tactics by altitude and speed, the Japanese sought the enemy with their ear, and almost always they found him too late. If this sounds unbelievable, that's because it is. And if you were surprised by this difference, write in the comments, unbelievable. Because in a war where seconds decide lives, silence was an executioner. The Mustangs operated as coordinated swarms. They flew in pairs, talked to each other, decided together. The Japanese, even when numerically superior, fought as individuals. Radio, or lack thereof, was a turning point of the ages. More than weapons, more than speed, what determined air dominance was the system. And in this, Japan was decades behind. The next time they tried to respond to the attack, it was with a new tactic. It did not require communication, nor return. Only one target and one direction, because when the radio falls silent, despair screams. Flying is sailing, and those who don't know where they are already lost. For American pilots, each mission began long before takeoff. Teams of meteorologists analyzed winds, pressure, humidity, temperature at altitude. Reconnaissance planes flew hours before the main force, charting the clouds, safe routes, and pockets of turbulence. The maps were updated weekly, with intelligence information, aerial photographs, and radar data. Each Mustang took off with a flight plan, specific radio frequency, emergency codes, return route, and rescue coordinates. And perhaps more importantly, he knew that if he fell, someone would come for him. American submarines operated west of Japan with the sole mission of rescuing downed pilots. Survival radios, signal buoys, search planes, and even coastal patrols were part of the logistical ecosystem that kept the pilot alive even after the worst. In Japan, the scenario was the opposite. The maps still used measurements taken in the 1920s. Some regions of the Pacific appeared as patches or islands with old colonial names. Compasses, when available, suffered magnetic interference at certain altitudes. Many pilots learned to sail by the sun, a method that relied on good, cloudless weather and intuition. There was no coordination between meteorological units and squadrons. In several missions, fighter jets were launched even with storms forecast. The pilots didn't know, and neither did the captains. The Japanese doctrine valued spirit, initiative, instinct, but heaven does not respect intentions, just precision. The American pilot, as he moved hundreds of miles away from Iwo Jima, flew confidently, data-fed, radio-guided, with checkpoints at every step of the mission. The Japanese, even over their own territory, flew in a maze. Many got lost trying to intercept bombers, others missed the altitude, or simply disappeared without a trace. There was no contingency plan. There was no plan. The difference was in the method. The sky was the same, but one side treated it as science, the other as destiny. And destiny by itself is a broken compass. With each American mission, the return numbers were close to 90%. Even in intense fighting, the recovery rate was high. In Japan, in certain weeks in April, more than half of the fighters sent did not even return. Some fell in combat, others ran out of fuel, and many simply became disoriented. A data from the American High Command in May 1945 revealed that of the 213 Japanese aircraft lost in 4 weeks, at least 40 had no direct combat record. In other words, they disappeared. If this surprises you, comment, "Shocking data," because the war here was not decided by bullets, but by compasses. The American aircraft flew as part of a system, the Japanese as a survivor. When the Mustang crossed the sky, it didn't just attack, it knew where to turn back. In Japan, flight was a roulette of clouds, wind, and faith, even blind, needs direction. In the next part, we'll get into the heart of this logistical contrast, the system that allowed the Americans to launch 1,000 planes a day, with refueling, ammunition and mechanics on standby, while Japan dismantled its own planes to keep half a dozen in the air. Because even before taking off, the result was already being assembled, piece by piece. It was June 1st, 1945. The mission was clear: take off from Iwo Jima, cross the Pacific, and attack strategic targets in Osaka. More than 150 Mustangs were prepared for flight, experienced men, planes fueled, route mapped out, weather forecasted. But the prediction failed. Over the sea, a cold front moved faster than expected, enveloping the American formation in dense clouds, violent turbulence and zero visibility. What was supposed to be a precision mission became a blind crossing. The radios worked, the instruments were calibrated, but the sky had closed. Within minutes, the organization gave way to chaos. Planes were lost from each other, uncoordinated rotations began to emerge, and Mustangs began to fight against time, altitude, and the engine itself. The front was relentless. One by one they began to fall, not by gunfire, not by combat, but because of ice on the wings, because of fuel failure, because of disorientation. When they returned to Iwo Jima, 27 planes were missing. Only 3 had been shot down by enemy fire. The other 24 were swallowed by the clouds. It was the largest loss of Mustangs in a single long-range mission, and it was caused only by nature. Black Friday was not a Japanese victory. It was a reminder. The American war machine was powerful, but not invincible. Not even the best systems could tame an unpredictable sky. And yet, the structural difference persisted. Many of the pilots who crashed were rescued by patrol submarines. Others launched inflatable boats, set off flares, transmitted emergency coordinates, and dozens survived. Because behind every Mustang there was a rearguard, a silent fleet of logistics, search and rescue. Each American mission was a visible tip of a logistical iceberg. For one plane to take off, there were 10 others on the ground sustaining its flight. Japan, in this same period, no longer even had enough fuel to maintain regular missions. Its pilots avoided flying in cloudy skies for fear, not just of the weather, but because they knew that if they crashed, there would be no rescue. No boat, no radio, no hope. The climate for them was a final judge. To the Americans, it was an enemy. Dangerous but unprofitable. The difference was not in the sky. It was on the ground. And as much as Black Friday was a blow, it did not stop the pace of operations. The next day, more Mustangs were prepared. More flights were launched. The chain did not break, because while Japan depended on good weather to fight, the United States learned to fight the weather, and they won. However, the sky still reserved its most unexpected blow, something that would not come from time, nor from strategy, but from despair. The next mission over Japan would not find pilots willing to fight. I would find something different, something that didn't come back. In the last months of the war, Japan's sky ceased to be a battlefield and became an empty space, not by choice, but by exhaustion. The Imperial Air Force, once feared, gradually and quietly disappeared. Entire squadrons disappeared from operational reports, not through dramatic defeats, but through technical starvation. The hangars still existed. The pilots were still marching, but there was no fuel, there were no parts, there were no targets. Many fighters were buried before they even took off. Others were permanently stationed, used as donors for parts to keep 1 or 2 units flying. When these also failed, the final decision was made. The remaining planes would be turned into human bombs. Japan could no longer fight, only collide. The Mustangs then proceeded to fly over enemy territory with a different kind of authority. They no longer faced organized resistance. The radars picked up silence. The radios received static. American formations flew over cities, factories, ports, and nothing went up to intercept them. It was as if the air had been emptied of adversaries. In May, June, and July 1945, several escort missions departed Iwo Jima without firing a single shot, and that was more disturbing than the combat. Because silence reveals not only defeat, but the absence of any capacity to respond. For the American drivers, it was a technical victory. For the Japanese, a spiritual humiliation. The Empire, which once believed that the sky was the domain of divine kamikazes, now watched blue being taken over by foreign engines, with mathematical precision, as a faceless occupation. Civilians watched the Mustangs go by like clockwork, no emotion, no hurry, no fear. And they knew the country was naked. The death of the Japanese Air Force did not happen with a devastating attack. It disintegrated due to lack of parts, lack of logistics, doctrinal isolation. Instead of epic battles, there were operational voids. Instead of desperate fighting, there were locked hangars. America's greatest weapon wasn't the Mustang, it was constancy, the relentless repetition of missions, flights, maintenance, fueling, and restarting. The gear did not stop, and those who have no way to interrupt the gear are crushed by it. The irony of this story is that the solution for Japan was in front of them from the beginning: standardization, coordination, scale. But instead, they chose the symbol, the glory, the sacrifice, and they lost the essential permanence. If you're enjoying unraveling the behind-the-scenes of this collapse with precision and context, enjoy the video and subscribe. This helps us keep alive the story that many ignore, the story of the system that won. But there was still one last movement before the final curtain, a ritual that required no fuel, no spare parts, no return. A flight without radio, without a plan, without return. Japan had lost its fighters, but it still had its martyrs. And the next mission carried no pilots. He carried irreversible decisions. For the Japanese people, accustomed to looking at the sky with reverence and awe, what began as a distant noise turned into an unbearable realization. Mustangs didn't just fly like war machines, they flew like sentences. In broad daylight, with open sun, without camouflage or haste, American fighters streaked the skies of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya. They machine-gunned tactical targets, yes, locomotives, depots, docks, airfields, but above all, they machine-gunned the narrative of inviolability that sustained the empire for generations. Civilians didn't just see airplanes, they saw the collapse of a promise. The imperial palace, once surrounded by forbidden zones and mystical beliefs, was now flown over by Western engines, not as a target, but as a symbol, to show that there were no more shrines. Accounts preserved in diaries and letters describe the almost religious astonishment of families, seeing low-flying fighter jets cross the city as if they owned the space. There was no alarm, there was no reaction, just the metallic sound of defeat hovering over schools, temples, markets. Children began to recognize the shape of the Mustang's wings. The elders learned to count the number of passages before silence. Japan, a nation that educated its population in the idea of sacrifice for the homeland, watched from the ground a war that it could no longer fight, and he realized, with his neck bent upwards, that the defeat was no longer military. It was spiritual. The Mustangs became a daily reminder that the enemy had not only arrived, but did not intend to leave. They were not isolated high-altitude bombers that came once a month. There were daily patrols, steel escorts, precision raids. They were the normalization of dominance. And when domination becomes routine, fear gives way to intimate surrender. Many civilians reported the change in perception. The sound of the engines stopped causing panic and started to cause resignation. A 72-year-old man interviewed decades later recalled, "When the Mustangs passed by, no one ran anymore. We stopped, we looked, we knew the weather had changed." The war thus ceased to be a collective effort and became a state of waiting. Wait for the next attack, wait for the next siren, wait for the end. In its obsession with honor and sacrifice, Japan ignored that wars are won first and foremost with permanence, and nothing symbolized this permanence more than the P-51Ds crossing the skies on timed routes, like metronomes of the apocalypse. To Japanese civilians, Mustangs were not just fighters, they were signs, warnings, announcements of a time that was ending. The war had left books, radios, and newspapers, and now it passed right above my head every day, with the low sound of an engine and the coldness of a calendar. And if there was anything more painful than losing the war, it was to see it pass, without being able to prevent it. With each low, one was ruined, and the next scene wouldn't come from the air, it would come from the sea. Because when even the skies become routine routes for the enemy, the only question that remains is, what remains to fall? World War II was, among many things, a turning point of eras, and few contrasts capture this transition, like what was seen in the skies of the Pacific in 1945. On one side, young Japanese went on missions of no return, with scarves tied to their heads, handwritten messages in their pockets, and farewell ceremonies where silence weighed more than steel. On the other, Young Americans embarked on 7-hour missions with standardized checklists, accurately folded maps, printed weather instructions, and tanks calibrated to a tolerance of 0.5%. One flew with the soul, the other with systems. Japan bet on its ethos, the spirit of the eternal warrior, the Bushido transposed to the cockpit. But he faced a force that did not fight with symbols, but with processes. Mustangs weren't just machines, they were physical manifestations of a mentality. Each screw represented a rational decision, each panel a study, each route an equation. While Japan sought transcendence, the United States delivered repetition. And war, which for centuries had rewarded isolated heroism, now crowned collective efficiency. A kamikaze pilot wrote poems before leaving. An American pilot checked the octane level of the left tank. Both were convinced that they were doing the right thing, but only one would return. And this is not by dishonor, but by method. The Mustang was the opposite of the Zero. While the Japanese fighter was light, agile, and almost handcrafted, the P-51D was dense, technological, regulated by British reverse engineering, English engines, American auxiliary tanks, and a global supply system. Japan produced airplanes with what was left, the United States with what they planned. The Mustang symbolized the end of a romantic era of war, where the duel was between men and courage. It brought the beginning of an era where the duel was between spreadsheets, warehouses, and refineries. It was the birth of modern warfare, and in this birth, sacrifice, as noble as it was, became worth less than preventive maintenance. The world the samurai were trying to preserve evaporated with each low flight of a Detroit-made fighter. Japanese bravery, admirable as it was, could no longer compete with an entire continent synchronized by a conflict. America mobilized 16 million people, 300,000 aircraft, thousands of ships, and converted its culture to production. While Japan wrote farewell letters, the U.S. printed maintenance manuals. The outcome was not determined on the battlefield. It was designed on assembly lines. The Mustangs that flew over Japan didn't just come from hangars, they came from the future. And for the Japanese, still stuck in the past, the war was already lost, even before takeoff. Because when the confrontation is between emotion and structure, time always ends up favoring those who know where to step. But before peace came, there was one last point to be crossed, and it wouldn't be in the air, because American superiority still had a card, and it didn't fly. She fell. The sky of Tokyo, for centuries considered a spiritual domain, unblemished, unreachable by foreign hands, became the scene of one of the most symbolic turning points in military history. When the Mustangs appeared in broad daylight over the imperial capital, it wasn't just an air operation. It was a warning, an announcement that the ancient world, ruled by myths, ancestral honor, and solitary bravery, had been overtaken by a new paradigm. The war was now won with integration, with calculation, with supply. What the Japanese pilots saw in that sky, long rows of American single-engine fighters appearing out of nowhere, maneuvering freely, firing accurately, returning efficiently, was more than a threat. It was a message. Modern warfare does not respect symbolic borders. It invades with spreadsheets, with radio frequency, with octane, and with industrial precision. The Mustang was just the visible tip of an iceberg of 48 states working in unison, engineers perfecting aerodynamics, workers assembling standard parts, meteorologists tracking winds and radars, lining up flights 1,000 kilometers from the origin. It was the victory of a system, and in this system there was no room for heroic improvisation. Good, when it wants to triumph, needs more than courage. It needs structure, method, persistence. That's what crossed the skies over Japan that April. Not just an airplane, but the concrete result of a civilization that, even with its mistakes, has learned to synchronize forces. The P-51 scene over Tokyo sealed more than a battle. It sealed a change of era. The era of closed empires has given way to the world connected by cables, waves, and logistical flows. The sky had changed owners, and history from then on too. But for this new world to fully emerge, the most devastating sound of war was still missing, and it wouldn't come from a Mustang. It would come from a lone bomber, flying too high to intercept, carrying the weight of all the decisions not made. When the Mustangs silently crossed the skies over Mount Fuji, it wasn't just the sound of engines that echoed. It was the invisible noise of the collapse of an entire doctrine. Japan, which had built its strength on myths of invincibility and sacred courage, saw at that moment that modern warfare did not respect beliefs. It obeyed production, precision, and scale. The P-51D was not just a combat aircraft. It was the materialization of a philosophy that united science, industry, and pragmatism. In each machine gun dive, in each safe return to base, he reaffirmed what the radars had already announced. The sky now belonged to those who built it on the ground. And as the empire disintegrated amid ceremonies and despair, Americans wrote the future with refined fuel, up-to-date maps, and working radios. The outcome was technical, the defeat, statistics. But the lesson remains human, because war, even if born of emotion, is won by structure. Bravery can take off, but only logistics guarantee landing. As General Heinz Guderian declared when reviewing post-war maps, we were defeated by trucks. If you value this search for facts, for accuracy, and for historical justice, support our work with your like and subscribe to the channel. Your participation keeps alive this mission of revealing the real backstage of the war. Comment below, what was the most unbelievable data you discovered in this video, and ring the bell, because the next chapter is even more devastating. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.